Welcome to the day that hasn't arrived yet. Today is the day when we realize it's already too late, and the cruelest part is that this realization does not arrive with a single explosion, a final warning siren, or one dramatic headline that tells the whole planet the game is over. It arrives in fragments, in patterns, in delayed understanding, in the slow horror of connecting events that once felt separate. It arrives the way true catastrophe usually arrives, not as a moment, but as a recognition. Because the future rarely destroys itself in one obvious step, it slips past the point of return while people are still busy naming, debating, monetizing, minimizing, distracting, optimizing, and postponing. For most of human history, danger was visible. You saw the fire, heard the army, smelled the plague, watched the crop fail, and knew something terrible had entered the world. But modern danger often behaves differently. It scales invisibly, accumulates quietly, hides inside convenience, complexity, profit, and normal routine. It does not ask for belief, it only asks for enough delay, enough confusion, enough comfort, enough noise, enough people saying not yet, not really, not this time. The civilization that realizes it is too late will not be one that lacked intelligence, it will be one that lacked timing, because intelligence can describe a cliff while still driving toward it. And that may be one of the defining tragedies of the species. We are very good at detecting disaster once it becomes undeniable. We are much worse at acting while there is still a price to pay, but before there is no alternative left. The first signals are always easy to ignore because they are expensive to take seriously. They ask for sacrifice before consensus, restraint before panic, change before proof feels emotionally complete, and most societies resist that kind of request with all their strength. Because prevention never feels as urgent as response. And warning never feels as convincing as ruin. That is why almost every irreversible turning point in history is surrounded by people who can already see it, people who write about it, model it, measure it, fear it, and still fail to stop it, not because they were silent, but because the world around them remained economically, politically, and psychologically organized around waiting for cleaner evidence, waiting for better leadership, waiting for someone else to move first, waiting for the pain to become universal enough that action no longer looks extreme. By the time that threshold is crossed, the structure of the future has often already hardened. That is what too late really means, not that nothing can be done, but that the range of possible futures has collapsed, that options once available have vanished quietly, one by one, while people were still speaking as if history remained wide open. Climate is the easiest example, not because it is the only one, but because it teaches the pattern so clearly. For decades, the debate was never truly about whether the danger existed, but about whether the cost of early action felt politically tolerable. Every year of delay looked survivable in isolation, every compromise sounded pragmatic, every warning sounded a little dramatic until the baseline itself moved, and once the baseline moves long enough, people start adapting to decline instead of preventing it. The unacceptable becomes normal by arriving gradually, and normality is one of the strongest sedatives ever discovered. But this pattern extends far beyond climate. It applies to privacy, to democracy, to mental health, to inequality, to social trust, to truth itself, to the architecture of human attention. Again and again, societies do not lose essential things in a single theft, they lose them by normalizing each intermediate stage, until the final condition would have horrified earlier generations but feels merely exhausting to those living inside it. That is how being too late hides from the mind. It does not appear as a cinematic ending, it appears as degraded expectation. The city feels a little less safe, the institutions a little less trusted, the air a little stranger, the children a little more anxious, the friendships a little thinner, the work a little less human, the screens a little more total, the lies a little more ambient, the future a little harder to imagine. And because no single day carries the full weight of the transformation, ordinary people continue living inside it without receiving the emotional permission to call it what it is. They tell themselves this is just how things are now, and in that sentence entire worlds disappear. The most dangerous phrase in any declining civilization may be not "this is good," but "this is normal," because once a people confuses adaptation with safety, it can remain calm while walking into forms of dependency and fragility that would once have triggered alarm. We adapt to polluted attention, adaptive surveillance, synthetic intimacy, automated manipulation, emotional exhaustion, permanent distraction, algorithmic mediation, economic precarity, and the quiet replacement of agency with interface, and each adaptation makes the next one easier. The human nervous system is built to survive change. But that same ability can be exploited by systems that worsen life slowly enough to avoid revolt. We endure in increments, and increments can carry us somewhere catastrophic without ever requiring a dramatic surrender. The realization that it is already too late often comes not when the damage is maximal, but when reversibility dies, when people finally understand that what they thought was a phase was actually a transition, that what they thought was recoverable has become structural, that what they thought was temporary has taught institutions, markets, technologies, and habits to reorganize around the damage itself. Once a society starts building around the consequences of decline, decline becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure is much harder to reverse than a crisis. Think about loneliness. At first it looks like a personal problem, then a cultural trend, then a health issue, then a market, then an industry, and finally a design principle around which technologies, cities, labor systems, and relationships begin to reorganize. By the time people say this is destroying us, entire economies may already depend on the conditions that produced it. The same is true for misinformation, for addiction, for ecological collapse, for surveillance, for digital dependency, for the corrosion of attention, and for every future in which comfort and profit are extracted from wounds that were never meant to become permanent. That is another meaning of too late. The moment when the system no longer merely tolerates the damage but requires it. There is also a psychological reason people realize too late. The human mind protects itself through continuity. It prefers to believe that tomorrow will still be recognizable, that the center will hold, that warning signs remain negotiable, that there is more time, because to fully accept that a threshold has already been crossed is to accept grief, responsibility, and the humiliation of having lived beside a transformation you did not stop. Many people would rather live inside managed denial than experience that humiliation, especially when their daily routines still function well enough to maintain the illusion of control. Catastrophe in the modern age often coexists with convenience, and convenience is a powerful anesthetic. The deliveries still arrive, the screens still glow, the meetings still happen, the lights still turn on, the markets still open, and as long as surface functionality remains intact, people can postpone existential recognition almost indefinitely. This is why collapse in the future may feel less like falling and more like waking up inside a machine that still works beautifully while narrowing every meaningful human possibility. The worst systems do not fail loudly, they stabilize around diminished life, they continue providing enough comfort to suppress resistance while quietly draining autonomy, resilience, and depth. In such a world, too late is not the moment everything breaks. It is the moment everything still works, but only inside a shrunken horizon. The internet feels necessary, privacy feels nostalgic, ownership feels unreachable, nature feels decorative, truth feels tribal, intimacy feels mediated, freedom feels conditional, children feel optimized, and thought itself begins to belong partly to systems that interpret it. At some point, a civilization may look around and understand that it did not lose the future in a war. It traded it away in subscriptions, incentives, convenience layers, policy delays, growth models, and tiny tolerated degradations. That recognition will be unbearable because it means the decisive battles were not lost in dramatic final stands, but in meetings, updates, pricing decisions, habits, defaults, and emotional fatigue. It means history turned on thresholds people were too busy to feel. There will still be those who say it is never too late, and in one narrow sense they are right. Because as long as people are alive, action remains possible, but that phrase can also become a narcotic if used carelessly. There is a profound difference between saying something can still improve and saying the original possibilities are intact. A forest can regrow after fire, but not the same forest. A democracy can survive corruption, but not unchanged. A child can adapt to a damaged world, but adaptation is not innocence restored. A species can continue after a turning point and still have lost a version of life it will never recover. The language of hope becomes dishonest when it refuses to admit irreversible loss, and yet the language of despair becomes dishonest when it pretends nothing remains worth fighting for. The truth lives in the painful territory between them, where one admits that some doors have closed forever while others are still closing, where grief becomes not paralysis but clarity, where the goal is no longer to save an untouched future, but to prevent a wounded future from becoming unlivable. Perhaps that is when people will finally realize it is too late, when they stop arguing about whether the line exists and start arguing about how far past it they are, when emergency stops sounding alarmist and starts sounding administrative, when every proposed solution is really just adaptation to loss, when children inherit not plans but damage control, when the people in power begin quietly protecting themselves rather than publicly promising restoration, when markets price in what politicians still deny, when ordinary citizens start shrinking their dreams to match a world they no longer trust to improve, and when nostalgia stops pointing backward to childhood and begins pointing backward to a future that once seemed possible, that may be the clearest sign of all, the moment a society becomes nostalgic not for what it had, but for what it expected to have, that is the emotional signature of lateness, the grief of realizing that an anticipated world has died before arriving. So when will we realize it is already too late? Not when the sky falls, not when one system crashes, not when a final expert says the words everyone feared. We will realize it when reversibility quietly disappears, when damage becomes default, when adaptation replaces prevention, when institutions manage decline better than they imagine renewal, when convenience keeps functioning inside worsening conditions, and when millions of people feel, all at once and too slowly, that they are no longer living at the beginning of a crisis, but in the middle of a consequence. We will realize it on the day the future stops feeling delayed and starts feeling cancelled, and by then, what remains will not be the power to undo everything, but the responsibility to decide how much more can still be lost. This was another day from the future. Until next time.